about to make love, this is not a time for a careful disquisition on the biomechanics of arousal. You'll break the spell. Don't want to interrupt important things with science at all times. And I appreciate that, and I think a lot of people think that. I'm sullying a sort of sacred precinct by even talking about how science could explain creativity or the mind or ethics or any of these wonderful things. I'm Dennett. I'm a philosopher. I'm interested in how the mind works, and for me that means I'm interested in the science of how the mind works and how we might actually create something like a mind, and how nature has created something like a mind, how it could have evolved in the first place. I think the ultimate question each of us asks is, what am I and what am I here for? What's the meaning of life? We're making a lot more progress on the first question, what am I, than on the second. But I think we can see that the good answers to what is the meaning of life depend on getting clear about what we are and how we got here. When I was a freshman, I read Descartes' Meditations, Cogito ergo sum. He said, the one thing that's really certain is that I'm thinking and that I am conscious of my thought. When I think I know that I am, cogito ergo sum. And I was immediately struck by how brilliant it was and how wrong it was. I never had a moment's hesitation it was wrong. And the question was, well, if that's wrong, what's right? And I've been working on that ever since. When I wrote my first book, Content and Consciousness, back in the 60s, I suppose the fundamental feature of the perspective shift that I was trying to propose was a certain turning inside out of the ego, of the self, getting rid of the idea that I am some agent that sits in the middle of my brain and then runs the body like a puppeteer. And this has implications for how you do theory that are initially extremely counterintuitive. It means, for instance, that if you're doing a theory of vision, you have to break the idea that the product of vision is a picture in your head. Because if you've got a picture in your head, you've got to have some little guy looking at the picture. We have to move beyond that and realize that, no, there's no little picture in the head. What I saw was that you have to take the work that that little man in the brain does, and you have to distribute it around in the rest of the brain and the body. So you have to get rid of that showplace in between the ears where the little man sits, and that's a hard job, but that's the job I've been working on all these years. Right now, there are millions and millions, billions of little symbiont visitors inhabiting my body, and they're in my hair and my skin and my gut and swimming through my bloodstream. Oh, help, isn't that awful? But of course, most of them are entirely benign, and some of them I couldn't live without, and we're a happy team. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is to get people to think the same way about their brains. And there's nothing but mindless neurons in there. The factory is empty. There's no big boss in there at all. It is an unsettling thought, but you can get used to it. And once you do, you realize that that's what you are. It doesn't mean that you don't exist. It just means that's what you're made of. If I could give a prize for the single best idea anybody ever had, I'd give it to Darwin. Before Darwin, I think it just stood to reason for just about everybody that it takes a great, big, magnificent, wonderful, intelligent thing to make a lesser thing. You never see a pot making a potter. You never see a horseshoe making a blacksmith. It's always big, fancy, smart things making stupid things. And Darwin turned that just upside down. Said, no, we can have an absolutely mindless, ignorant, mechanical process which generates minds. And then we could begin to see how the sorts of things that minds do, that is to say, designing things, creating things, inventive things, could be done by matter. So I would put Darwin as the opener of the age, and then I guess I'd jump to Turing, because Alan Turing is the one who then saw how to demonstrate mind arising out of matter. Turing saw that with great clarity right from the outset, back in 1949, when he published his classic piece, Can Machines Think? He was already thinking ahead to the world of artificial intelligence. He saw how you could eliminate the smart mind from processes that heretofore have always taken intelligence and create a machine which could take over simple human tasks of computation and, by imaginative extension, anything that any calculator or thinker could do. An algorithm is a procedure that requires no intelligence. It's just a mechanical procedure. And that's what our minds are made of. Lots of little bits doing very rigid, ungraceful, inflexible things. But when you put them together in enough numbers, in enough ways, the result you get is that wonderful, lifelike, mental world that we exhibit to ourselves and to others. A few years ago, I was interviewed for an Italian newspaper, and the headline was, "Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot." Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. The idea that you can somehow boil a mind, a spirit down to brain activity is just deeply repugnant to many people. People want their minds to be beyond all measure. The idea that their minds are boringly finite is not attractive. And so people want to believe that there's more and more and more and more in their mind than any science can ever tell them. One of the problems with explaining consciousness is that people think they're conscious of a lot more than they actually are conscious of. So one of the first things you have to do before doing a good theory of consciousness is you have to beat consciousness back down to size. You have to get a proper account of what the phenomenon is. For instance, in vision, we tend to have the idea that we take in this whole wonderful world outside and have this inner replica of the whole world there somehow in our conscious mind. And that's just not true. So it seems that way, but it's just not true. We take in a lot less and we hold in our heads a lot less than we think. And I propose some experiments in Consciousness Explained that would dramatically reveal this. Change blindness is one of my favorite demonstrations to convince people that they don't know what they think they know about their own consciousness. If you show a person a picture and then distract them for just a brief fraction of a second, then show them a variation on that picture. You move something, you change the color of something. Very, very often, people will not be able to see that change at all. And one can show these pictures to people, A, B, A, B, A, B, with a little blank in between, and people just won't see the change. Everybody in the field knew, of course, that our vision is built up piecemeal from separate fixations. Your eyes move point to point to point to point. You pick up a glimpse here and a glimpse there. And they had the idea that these glimpses were were used to sort of tile a plane, as to fill in this region and then fill in that region and then fill in this other region, and that this built up in your head a glorious big picture with all those details captured by all those individual glimpses. But in fact, you take in a lot less than that. And that isn't all put together anywhere. It doesn't have to be all put together anywhere. All you have to do is just keep track of the things you need to keep track of to do the things you're doing. And the rest of it just isn't there. Well, I think what upsets people even more than the discovery that they don't know everything about their own minds, their own conscious minds, is the very idea that their mind might be a mechanism, that there isn't something magical about the mind, that it's just neurons doing their ultimately electromechanical things. One of my favorite artifacts is the British Seagull outboard motor, which is dead simple, and their motto is, "What isn't there can't break." Much the same could be said about consciousness. What isn't there doesn't have to be explained. It's just not there. Putting your knowledge to the test in the real world is something that philosophers don't do much of. I saw a joke about philosophers that said that philosophers are the ones who say, we know it's possible in practice, we're trying to figure out if it's possible in principle. Philosophers are a very abstract profession, and we tend to live in a very rarefied atmosphere. And I think that what's different about me as a philosopher is that I fill my life with lots of hard, concrete, practical stuff, which is great fun in itself. It's just very satisfying to have lots of practical know-how and to use it, and to have to use it on a regular basis. Almost 10 years ago, I found an extraordinary sort of pre-computer, pre-electronic robotic dog. We don't know who made it. We don't know even half the things that it does. For a number of years, off and on, when we can squeeze a few hours out, Seymour Pafford and I have been reverse engineering this marvel. It's a work of incredible ingenuity, just packed with wires and switches and curious devices. The sleuthing is, of course, half the fun. The basic appeal of robotics is we understand a process when we can make a model of it. So the idea of a robot is, let's see if we really understand what intelligence is, what thinking is, what perception is, and let's use as alien a medium as possible. Let's make it out of silicon and aluminum and glass instead of out of proteins, and we'll learn a lot about what the actual function of all those proteins is by seeing if we can mimic that function in other materials. Consider the question of whether roboticists could make a small robotic bird that could fly around in a room, land on a twig, catch insects on the fly. Incredibly difficult. Not because there's anything magical or mysterious about a bird doing that, it's just so complicated. So what you do instead is you break the problem down into parts and you do the parts. You make an airplane, you don't try to make a swallow. The same thing is true of making a humanoid robot. You break human intelligence down into parts. You make a system that can do this. Maybe you make a system that can answer questions or play chess or do 100 other things. and you learn a little bit about how we do it. I view artificial intelligence as a way of doing philosophy. When people ask me what philosophy is, I say philosophy is what you do when you don't know what the right questions are yet. Once you got the questions right, then you go answer them, and that's typically not philosophy. That's one science or another. Anywhere in life where you find that people aren't quite sure what the right questions to ask are, what they're doing then is philosophy. Want to go out to the bear path? Why should we be good? The traditional answer is because God tells us to be good and God created us. Not an entirely satisfactory answer for, I think, most people. For many people it is. Well, if we're naturalists, if we think that we're a biological species that has evolved on this planet, according to the laws of nature, then at first it seems that there's just not going to be an answer to this question. There couldn't be. I think that's wrong. I think that one can see how we have evolved a perspective on ethical thinking. Many people are worried that a frankly materialistic understanding of this sort of the mind leads to moral nihilism of some sort. I don't believe that for a minute. It leads to a refounding of morality, ethics on a naturalistic basis. One has to understand how we as a species have evolved to the point where we have culture, where we then create ethical systems which we negotiate and reevaluate and achieve something like an equilibrium of agreement on how to live and why. And once we've got that naturalistic framework for ethics in place, the meaning of our acts is, if anything, clearer. Would it be dangerous for the people of Great Britain to start driving on the right tomorrow? Oh, yes. It would be carnage, unless it was very carefully planned, the way the Swedes did not so many years ago when they switched in a single weekend from driving on the left to driving on the right. Now, when Darwin came along, he proposed an inversion of the standard way of thinking that was much more dramatic than switching from driving on the left to driving on the right. And he didn't have Swedish bureaucrats to plan the move. So the world was hit with Darwin unprepared. And wherever you get these collision zones between the Darwinian inversion and the old pre-Darwinian non-inverted attitude, that's where you make problems. And that's where tempers flare up and where people misinterpret each other badly. Recently, the Pope has declared that evolution is a fact. But he then says, except for the human soul. You can't get, by Darwinian means, to the human soul. The way many non-religious people, many atheistical people say is, well, I can see how Darwinian processes can explain the evolution of design in the natural world, but I don't see how it can explain, the creativity of a Shakespeare or the insight of an Einstein. I don't see how it can explain the wondrous workings of the mind. Well, part of me wants to say, what amazing hubris. You say that algorithmic processes can explain a nightingale, but not an ode to a nightingale. You think an ode to a nightingale, a poem, is that much more wonderful than a real nightingale? You don't know enough about nightingales. If algorithmic processes can account for all the brilliant design that goes into making an actual nightingale, I think it can handle a poem too. One of the noblest facts about human beings is that we'd like to have some way of expressing our gratitude for the world we live in. There's nobody to take our thanks. When I see a beautiful sunset or a fantastic scientific experiment or a lovely philosophical theory, I think, oh, thank you, thank you. It's so wonderful to have this in the world. I'm very grateful for this. Well, to whom can I be grateful? If I don't believe there's a big capital A author in the sky, if I don't believe there's a creator God, then there really is nobody to thank. Just my lucky stars. Well, that'll just have to do.